I thank Kelly for kindly organising today and our guest speakers. You're going to learn most from your peers. It's really important. Now, we're here in law school, it's competitive. Yes, it is. However, also be optimistic. And criminal law, I'll kid you not, I spent 16 years, as some of you know, as a prosecutor, both in London and in Australia. Criminal law is difficult, it is demanding, but it is so rewarding. Not financially most of the time, but the satisfaction. You are dealing, and I'm sure we'll hear this from our various guest speakers today as well, real issues, real people making a difference, whether you're prosecuting or whether you are defending. Try and think, now, a lot of students think, I'll just try and get a clerkship, whether, say, with Minter Ellison or maybe with one or two of the leading criminal law firms in town. There are other opportunities, and I'm glad we're going to be hearing today from a diverse range of perspectives. One opportunity, think about work with the Indigenous sector. Places like Alice Springs, Darwin, Catherine, in Western Australia. I've got some friends, some who started students who do really valuable, interesting work there, including as internships. Also, quite often students think just about Adelaide. As part of the work at the Law Reform Institute, we've gone to Port Lincoln, Mount Gambier, Port Augusta, and there is a shortage of good law graduates there. Most law graduates are very resistant to travelling to the country. Nothing wrong with it, because the quality of the work you get, whether in criminal law, civil or commercial, is really good. Also, don't underestimate family law. Family law sometimes has a bad reputation in practitioners, but again, it's a really interesting, valuable area of law dealing with real people, real work, real issues, as is childcare. These are areas of law which are sometimes overlooked, but there's a lot of overlap between criminal law, family law and child protection. Now, I worked for a number of years in the UK with the Crown Prosecution Service. Really enjoyable job, maybe with whatever's happening in the UK, with the EU exit, I'm probably glad I've been back in Australia the last few years. I have several former colleagues at the UK Bar who very generously, a couple of times a year, offer work experience placements to Australian law graduates. Also, don't underestimate how competitive you are. The English legal studies are very academic. You learn a lot of legal theory, but very little in the way of practical real-life skills. So Australian law graduates, not just in criminal law, but in commercial and civil litigation, are very highly valued in the UK. Amongst my former colleagues is a gentleman called Jonathan Polnay, who's now Treasury Counsel at the Old Bailey, David Joss QC at St Andrews Hill. These colleagues do really fascinating, interesting work. And if you do work experience in the UK, you are treated as a colleague. You're not just there to Xerox or hear war stories. The work sometimes can be difficult or demanding, but it's the same as you would find doing work internships or work experience in Australia. So I really commend your interest in criminal law. It's a really interesting and fascinating area of law. Sometimes it can be very difficult and confronting, but certainly you never have a quiet day at work. Thank you.
So hi everyone, I'm a graduate from Adelaide Uni. I did a double degree of International Studies and Law and graduated end of 2017 and got my practicing certificate end of last year. Just to begin with, I will make acknowledgements that we are meeting here on Kaurna land today, and Nina Mani to everyone here. I thought, what would I want to hear as someone that was at uni whether in my final year or second to final year, about entering the law, and so many great points have already been made about the overlap of different areas of law. Clearly everyone here today is interested in crim because of people focused or being more considered a people area of law. So I thought I'll talk a bit about my background and my journey into where I am today. So I'm currently a solicitor and project officer at the Women's Legal Service. I volunteered there for 4 years and have been working there for 2. I was very lucky to get a job in my final year as a paralegal and project officer, and there was a bit of overlap between study and work, which was a bit hectic. But also, I think sometimes as law students, it is very competitive, but I think it's important not to undervalue other experiences that you may have as well. I did Justice Net, I did Sister Pat, who was a free migration agent for refugees. But I think it's very important to also recognise those experiences, such as, have you been working a part-time job while doing uni? I was a young carer for my brother with autism. All these skills, which might not translate as well on your CV, are skills that employers do look for in the workplace. End of the day, you can know the law back to front. If you've got a client yelling at you who is going through homelessness, got a criminal charge and possibly had their children removed, you not being able to communicate with that client is going to be to your detriment as well. So please do not undervalue other experiences that you have in your life as well. I think it's the biggest mistake so many students make, and that there's this sort of competitive market where you feel like you need to tick off so many clerkships and so many other experiences to get ahead. Do not undersell yourself in what you probably already know what you do in your personal life as well. So that was the one thing I wish someone told me in uni as well. And on that note, I guess moving forward as well, is that everything had a purpose. So I had a bit of a different introduction into the law. I started off as a paralegal and project officer. So I have been doing work for 2 years on a phone application that's going to be called Ask Maria, which translates to Migrant Asylum Seeker Refugee Information Assistance Service. So it's an app that will be available in different languages for women to access information on about domestic violence, the law, and their legal rights and responsibilities. This came through community consultations, travelling all across South Australia, linking up with different service providers as well. And it has been an amazing experience that I would have never assumed would fall into my lap while being at law school as well. So I think sometimes trusting your own path and not comparing yourself to everyone else is the other biggest real talk that I would say to law students. You might not get that clerkship, you might not get that associate position, but really I think sometimes things pick you as you pick them. At the same time, do apply for everything. Don't ever think that you're not good enough for a position either. But I think at the same time, now I am doing case file work. My volunteer experience with the Women's Legal Service in their phone line means that dealing with clients face-to-face is now my bread and butter, and that can translate to any job whether I decide to enter criminal law or not. I guess for people that don't know much about the Women's Legal Service, it's predominantly family law, child protection, a bit of victims of crime compensation. We don't really do criminal law unless it's a minor matter. But I think one of the other biggest things that I would drive home is that the law doesn't work in a silo, and I think that's already been raised. Just for a bit of stats, because I do love stats with the work that I do around policy, is for all people that have a legal issue in South Australia, about 50% of people do. More people have 3 or more legal issues at one time than they would just one. So when you're dealing with clients, they're coming with an array of legal issues at one time. So even if you're working in the criminal law, there's never ever usually a chance that it's purely just working within the criminal law. And that does not even start to include non-legal needs as well. Do they have somewhere safe to stay? Centrelink, are they receiving any other supports? Psych appointments, mediation for children. There's so many things that is behind that client. So I think also to be aware of those sorts of services as well and give them a go. There's people, I'm sure Mark Castle drives at home the importance of alternative dispute resolution and mediation. There are amazing ways to get involved with the law through processes like that as well. I guess including the work that I do, so I've been very lucky to do many things from workshops where you consult with women. I've gone to Canberra and I've spoken to politicians advocating for services like community legal centres, putting on symposium. We did one about the new Child Protection Act that came into play about 2 years ago, and about what that would mean for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families, because the reality is a lot of children that are in out-of-home care do enter the youth court system and then do enter the criminal justice system later. So that's my biggest point, is that this criminal law does not work in a silo. So be open to many, many, many options as well. And then, I think, am I still all right with time? Keep going time. The last point I did want to raise, because I feel like this was one of the biggest things that was missed in law school as well, whether you enter the criminal law or whether you enter family law, child protection especially, please look after yourself as well. These are very, very tough areas of law. It is totally okay to say that you're not okay sometimes. You're working with people that are in heightened crisis situations, and no one is expecting you to be able to take that on and be perfect at it either. I'll be very honest, last year I experienced burnout and had to have a week off work and engage with counselling because of the high competitive marker of young lawyers entering the work profession. I don't mean to deliver bad news. I think it's so important to give everything a go. But I think one of the biggest things with these sorts of areas of law, because the reality is your clients will be tough. They'll be absolutely tough to work with. It is so rewarding, but it is tough. Do take care of yourselves at the same time. Speak to your mentors, speak to your supervisors, engage with your teachers post-uni. Ask for their experiences and speak to each other as well in the profession when you leave. Your classmates will be the biggest support systems that you can have as well. Otherwise, I think that might be mostly it. But yeah, so with the Women's Legal Service, the biggest thing that I have learned is you could have, it's never a dull day. Each person's different that comes through. You'll notice it as well with domestic violence reform laws that have come through as well. With the new Attorney General this year, with your new strangulation laws, your domestic violence disclosure schemes, what else is there? There's many more as well. These are all areas of criminal law as well when it comes to law reform and policy. Don't be afraid to put up your hand and enter those arenas such as the Attorney General's Department and advocate for those changes. It's not being a solicitor with your client, but they're protecting the people that might enter the criminal justice system later. So I say keep it flexible, trust in yourself, and also make sure you look after yourself in the process as well. Thank you.
Hi guys, my name's Eva and I'm just a penultimate year student, so I don't have as much to say as Chloe did, but I'm here to talk about my experience with the Law and Justice internship program, which I did in semester 1 of this year and is something that you should definitely all apply for. So I was placed with Justice Hinton at the Supreme Court of South Australia, and the structure of the program is it runs either across the summer where you do 5 weeks full time, or you do a 2-week placement, which I did in the holidays, and then 1 day a week through the whole of semester, and that's both semester 1 and semester 2. So I was really lucky to be placed at the apex of the judicial system, so it's definitely something you should get involved in. I mean, it's taken these judges their entire career to get there, and you can get there with one well-worded cover letter, so I think that you should, not even cover letter, just application. In terms of the work that I did with Justice Hinton, a lot of it was, as you hear, it wasn't the level of an associate that we'll get to hear from later, but the main benefit of that, and I think if you're interested in criminal law, the best thing you can possibly do is just get into the courtroom and just, for as long as possible, get familiarised with the court processes, with you'll be able to identify what good counsel looks like, what bad counsel looks like, and then after those hearings, having access to a judge who can then explain to you why this happened like this, what his decision-making process is behind this particular case is just an invaluable experience to have. So the work that I did was mainly observing in court, but then researching for Justice Hinton. So he's a very eccentric and wonderful person to work with, but he's often just have ad hoc research inquiries, and he's someone who's genuinely interested in what your opinion is on the law, so to be able to contribute to a live case matter in a back and forth conversation with a judge behind the scenes, and then have your research make its way into a judgment that's published is really a rewarding experience. And I think because it's a law subject, you have to produce a report at the end of your the subject, obviously for marks. And I think for me that was really beneficial to apply an analytical lens to what I was seeing in the criminal law system. So you could see these, particularly in sentencing. I know probably a lot of you are doing the sentencing elective right now, and there's a lot of controversial amendments around indefinite detention, high-risk offender orders, for me it was interesting to see that this produced visible discomfort within the judiciary. The judges were uncomfortable with making these decisions under the new legislation. So I ended up doing research into the indefinite detention regime, finding that this discomfort and reluctance was resulting in a lack of orders being made because people were concerned about the sort of long-lasting effects of indefinite detention in particular. So applying that sort of policy focus and analytical perspective is something that you get from the Law and Justice internship as a subject. And I would just say that there's other opportunities for placements with the Law and Justice internship. I know it's marketed as like a public law subject, but there is, I think, the Crown and the Attorney General's Department in particular. Justice Hinton is also moving, I think, this week or perhaps next week to the Department of Public Prosecutions, and I've heard that he's going to be taking on interns there as well, so definitely worth applying for that. In terms of other experience, I also work at a barrister's chambers that aren't criminal law focused, and I got that position through the Aurora internship program, so that was native title focused. So basically I would say to you, just if you're looking for experiences and you're early on in your degree, don't panic too much. Keep applying to things and they will eventually come. Once you have a couple of things to talk about in interviews, you'll start picking up more offers, and then eventually you'll get the experience that you need. But yeah, so I guess my two takeaways would be: find your way into a courtroom, find a barrister who will let you follow on to a case with them. I'm sure that they're great. To be involved with a case from start to finish is really invaluable. And secondly, just to keep applying and don't lose hope, because as you clock over to the second half of your degree, I found personally that things have started to make themselves available. So yeah, that's about all I have to say, I think.
Right, hi everyone, my name's Brian and I'm currently employed as a paralegal with the Aged Care Royal Commission, so that's down at Weymouth. And essentially I'll just give you kind of a background as to what I do. So as a paralegal, kind of a law clerk, I'm responsible for issuing notices. So if we have anyone who needs to be subpoenaed before the Royal Commission, or whether they have to produce documents, I'm that person who drafts that document and sends it out. So sometimes I'll draft a document and send it out to Menders Ellison, which is pretty cool. I'm sending them notices as well, that's pretty cool. I'm also kind of part of the Office of Solicitors Assisting. So there's kind of two main offices of the Royal Commission, which is the Counsel Assisting, who you'll see as the kind of the lawyers who give the presentation and cross-examine witnesses and present the evidence. And then there's the Solicitors Assisting, which is kind of the office I'm in, which kind of does all the background in terms of finding the evidence, getting that to counsel, and then getting the report done and finding suitable witnesses to come forward. So as part of my role as at the Solicitors Assisting, I'm basically here to review evidence. So we might get production from an aged care facility, so that might come into 1,000, 2,000 documents, and I'm essentially going through each document and reviewing it if it's relevant or not, or seeing if it has any kind of ties with other themes that we're looking at. So we're looking at things like substandard care in aged care. It could be abuse. It could be people with disability. It could be First Nations people and their care in aged care. So it's really interesting kind of field. And the reason why how I really got into aged care was kind of a bit of a mystery to me still. So I'm a third year student, I'm doing law and commerce, and essentially I've had no prior experience up until now. So I know some people here go to Roman Mitchell Community Legal Centre, and that's like a big shout out to those guys. But I've been there for roughly I'm approaching my third year now, and I've just been volunteering there and getting that experience. I had no actual experience before that, so I haven't really worked at a clerkship. I haven't really had, paid legal experience, but you just put your hand up and go for it. I'd also note that if you kind of look around, you find that there's a lot of temporary registers and a lot of not necessarily positions open, but they'll say, if you kind of apply for this temporary register, we might give you a call later in the future. And that's exactly what I did. So I applied for a clerkship back in January for a commercial law clerk position with AGS. I didn't get it. And 6 months later down the track, just out of nowhere, they said, look, you weren't a penultimate student, but because you've kind of got a good experience with, Roman Mitchell and you kind of got good interests, we'd like to take you on. And that's exactly what happened. I got my role there. One thing I also note is I feel there's like this general mood, I guess, in the law school that, I don't really want to reach out to, to apply because I'm afraid of getting rejected. And that's a really strong mood. I'd say just go for it. I used to apply for Macca's and KFC. I got rejected to both of them. Woolies, Coles, you name it. I got rejected by everyone. But no, seriously, I did. One thing I'd noticed though would be, I find this analogy really useful. It's like when you're looking for a law job, it's kind of like a butterfly. You can't really chase it, but sometimes if you kind of go with the flow, the butterfly will just come on your shoulder. And that's exactly what happened in my instance. So I'd definitely say go for it. Another thing I've realised while I've been working at the Royal Commission is you will be completely out of depth. Like, seriously, nothing in law school will ever prepare you for going into an actual law office and doing the work. The first day, I had this task where I had to kind of look at some recommendations and also code some evidence to see what should be in the report. And essentially it involved looking at 200 documents. So I looked through all of them and I had no idea. I marked all of them relevant. I had no clue what I was doing. And I guess part of that is also just asking people, just like people are there to help, especially the solicitors. They actually want to help you do the job well. And that's something that I've learned as I've worked there for roughly 6 months now. Another piece of advice is attention to detail is really important. You wouldn't realise how important that is, especially when it comes to reviewing evidence. So I've looked through 14,000 pages of transcripts of my other law clerk. There's only 2 of us in the whole office. Just the past week, I've gone through 1,500 documents, reviewing them, and they span 40 pages each. Like, it's a really big task. And you have to start small. So even if you look at, when you're working in groups, one thing I notice with group members is everything will be in different fonts or different font sizes. And lawyers absolutely hate that. They absolutely hate that. But I've noticed that when I've kind of put attention to detail, changed the fonts to make it look all nice, and kind of make sure all the formatting is right, I've received so many compliments about the formatting of my work. It's great, So it's just small things like that. And if you also look at kind of your resume and your cover letter, I've kind of looked at some people's cover letters before, their resumes, and the way that you describe skills is really important. So for instance, at Roman Mitchell, it's part of my job, to fill out administrative forms. Now you could write on your resume, I fill out administrative forms. Alternatively, you could kind of play around with it and say, I complete and verify the integrity of various administrative and financial forms, right? Things to kind of make you stand out and realize that you are a professional, you can do it. And, being kind of a third year, I'm kind of a bit young in my law degree, the lawyers recognize that. And when you've got that youth, they're willing to help you out. So, whether that's if they ask you to, have a drink with them, go for it. Or have a coffee with them, absolutely go for it. I'm not the type of person to kind of look to people as networks in the sense that, I won't reach out to a lawyer because, they might be helpful to me in the future. I kind of perhaps like to take the natural route. So if I like them, I'll have a chat to you. And what comes through that comes through that. So that's definitely my 2 cents. The final thing I would say would be how you would deal with confronting things in, your work in criminal law, whether that be, working for the prosecution or defence or family law and things like that. We've come across at the Royal Commission a lot of distressing images, whether that's people who've had unexplained bruises or had wound care, just lying in literally in their own feces. Like, we've had to look at that because it's just so, appalling. And part of that involves not so much compartmentalizing things and thinking, well, I'll kind of switch off about it, but instead using that trauma, using that grief to realize there are real people behind this, and I'm going to use that to kind of drive me forward. Because I was working on a case where we had this one particular elderly person who had been neglected, and the doctors didn't see her regularly enough, they didn't perform proper checks, and essentially through the course of her care, she had developed a wound, and the wound was so old there were maggots coming out of it. It's a truly traumatic experience, but you realize that there are real people behind it, and there are voices that need to be heard, because these people who we work for, they've often succumbed to dementia, so they don't know what's going on. They might be confused, they might be aggressive, they might be deceased, they might be a person who's vulnerable, they might come from migrant communities, they might be Indigenous, so they don't have a voice. And part of what drew me to, working with the Royal Commission, and I guess kind of my aspirations to work with the police more so as a detective or kind of a prosecutor there, is to really realise that these victims, they have stories, and they're just like us. They see the same moon, the same stars, and the trauma and the torture is real. And even if I'm not the person who's directly contacting witnesses or directly working with victims, if I can give counsel that information and help them do their job, those are the people who are going to give them that voice, then my job is done. So I guess to summarise, absolutely go for everything. Like, one thing that I'm doing right now is I'm kind of using my work experience as course credit. So there's this internship course in the commerce degree, I think it's called the Professions Internship. I'm now working in my paid role with the Royal Commission and using that as course credit. Just small things like that, just kind of being in the know and looking at what courses can definitely line up with your interests is a really big thing. And yeah, keep working at your resume, keep working at your cover letter, continue to apply, get your name on temporary registers, and you might end up working with me at the Royal Commission. So yeah, that's all I had to say really.
So hi everyone, my name's Sophia. I work at a barrister's chambers and I've been there for about a year now. I'm kind of fluctuating between full-time and part-time depending on my study. So I guess I'll kind of go into how I got the job, but also just some little tricks that I've kind of picked up along the way that seem really obvious, but you'd be surprised how many people don't abide by them. So I got it by chance. I was working, not working, I had some work experience at another chambers and I was following a barrister around like a lost puppy. And I was sitting in court, and before proceedings started, I just got talking to the girl next to me, and it turns out that she was leaving the position that I'm now in, and just by chatting about, I don't know, the weather or sport or whatever, we kind of made a connection and I got the job through that. So I kind of just bumbled through my law degree and, as I guess lots of people do. And I think in Adelaide especially, it's really important to kind of treat everyone as though they're going to give you a job one day, because there's not that many people here, so it pays to be nice to everyone around you, and it should be intentional anyway, but yeah. So within about a week of meeting her, I was at the desk kind of twiddling my thumbs and wondering what I was doing there. So my job kind of consists of part admin, part research assistant, just general assistant to all the barristers. So on the days that I'm there, it's just me and 9 barristers. So I'm kind of at their beck and call with whatever they want, and that extends to their solicitors and to the judges' associates that they work with, and the judges as well. So that communication kind of goes through me. So I guess another thing about being in Adelaide and being nice to the people around you, we get a lot of students coming through either for work experience or GDLP placements. I think if you are ever in a position where you're near other students, which I guess is right now, or GDLP students, it's really good to make those connections with those people, not so much for like networking as you said, but just getting out there and knowing the people that you'll eventually be working with in the future. It's important to feel like you're supported by the people that you'll eventually be working with. I guess a tip that I've picked up along the way is that barristers are really busy people, and if you ever find yourself in a barrister's chambers, I think it's important to be able to read people well. Surprisingly, some people just seem to not be able to do that. If somebody looks busy, I think people say that there's no such thing as a dumb question, but there is if it's at a bad time. It's a dumb question, and maybe just wait and ask someone else, or wait until they're free. So I think that's really important. Mental health seems to be something that's popped up a lot so far. I'm a really curious person, and I got something went past my desk one day, big red tape, it's like kind of confidential, don't look, so I looked, but it's okay because I'm allowed to. It's okay. And it was really confronting images, and I didn't stop thinking about those images for weeks after, so I kind of dug my own grave there. But I think it's important to realise whether or not you can overcome that kind of stuff in criminal law, because the stuff that we deal with it's rape, murder, manslaughter, and obviously counsel needs to know exactly what's gone on. So I guess that those sort of images pass my desk, and yeah, it's important to know whether or not you can actually deal with that as a student, and if you can, then that's great. I think it's criminal law I find really interesting, and it's almost the only thing that ever turned my head in law school. So yeah, I think that's all from me. I can't really think of anything else to say. Just get out there as much as you can, and yeah.
Hi, my name's Tabitha. I work in criminal defence. I've been working in law for 31 years, so that's probably longer than most of you have been alive. And I've been in criminal defence as a paralegal for the last 5 years, and I second what everyone has said about the mental health. You do come across some very, very confronting images, dead bodies, heads this way, legs that way, bodies opened up. I've had to watch videos of sexual assault, all sorts of different things. In my job, I predominantly interview clients and take their background instructions for insertion into submissions. That can also be really confronting. So again, if you're going to look at criminal law, make sure that you've got the strength to deal with those things and that you've got the tools in place to help you manage it, and that you don't take that home to your family. They don't need to hear those things, and they don't need you being in a mess when you get home because you've come across something that's been confronting. Taking background instructions from clients can be very confronting because a lot of them have come from very, very traumatic backgrounds, and you hear things that will curl your toes. I've also been involved in research. I was recently involved in research for a sentencing appeal for a young Indigenous man, and my research was directly used in the appeal, and we actually managed to successfully have his sentence reduced, which was great. I also prepare briefs for barristers. I've been heavily involved in preparing High Court appeal booklets and all sorts of things like that. I have been in law for a long time. I literally fell into it, but 31 years ago, jobs were a bit easier to get than they are today. I would definitely say if you're looking to work in criminal defence, get out there, offer yourself up for some work experience, and get yourself into a practice where they're going to throw you in the deep end and get you to do some of the nitty-gritty stuff. I've worked in various different areas of law. I've worked in civil, I've worked in family, I've done all sorts of things, and the jobs that I've always enjoyed the most is where I've had a solicitor that said, Tab, have a go at putting that statement of claim together and then let me have a look at it. Or, can you do a reply to that defence? And they just literally throw the stuff at you and you go, oh, okay. I'm in my final year of law. It's taken me this long to decide to get a law degree. But it is very interesting work. Criminal law is very challenging. It is very stressful and demanding, but it is also very, very interesting. So, yeah, go for it. Get out there. Put your name out there.
So I'm Eli. I've sort of got a bit of a roundabout way of ending up loosely in criminal law. For a bit of background, I've been volunteering with an organisation which works with kids that are in foster care for about 6 years now. So these are the kids that are mentioned. They're removed from their homes. They usually end up in the youth justice system pretty quickly. And then, unfortunately, a lot of them do end up in the adult justice system. There's a really big overrepresentation of Indigenous young people in that group. And so a lot of the way that I've come to look at criminal law is sort of, I guess some would call it a bit of an idealistic way of trying to sort out the reasons why people commit crime more than anything else. But after David's recommendations earlier in the year, I sort of hit up Aboriginal legal rights movement, and I got a job there in what's called the Aboriginal Visitors Scheme, which came out of the Royal Commission into the Deaths in Custody. So my job in that role is that I'm on call pretty much 24/7. If an Indigenous person gets arrested, we get a notification of what the arrest is and whether or not they've requested an Aboriginal visitor. So my role there is to go in, make sure that they've got medical support, that they're getting food, to check on their mental state, and generally just make sure that they've got access to calling family members as well if they're down from the APY lands or down from Alice Springs and stuff like that. And I guess the real important thing, if you are thinking of going into sort of defence related things and working with these really vulnerable people, is that it was said that criminal law doesn't exist in a silo, but the law school kind of exists in a bubble. And you don't realise what it's like until you work in these sectors. Just like it was mentioned before, I did the Aurora internship as well. And I've been offered work in Horsham, which is about halfway between Adelaide and Melbourne. And it was not my grades that got me that internship, and it's not my grades that got me a job offer. It was that they liked the way that I thought about things, and they liked the angle that I was coming into that work because of. It's not that my grades are terrible. I'm not saying you can have terrible grades. Like, they will look at that. But I mean, my grades were not above the GPA requirement when I applied for that. I wasn't in the right year level, but my 6 years of volunteering in that sector is what made them look. And so if you do volunteering, like it can be paid, like yes, paid work is better, but if you can't find paid work, fill up your time with volunteering and fill it up in the sector that you want to work in, because then they can tell when you apply for those jobs that you're interested in that, and it's not just something you've thrown on at the last minute. If you've got 4 years in a sector and that's the sector that you go into, then they really can tell that there's a solid interest there. I guess from that end, I'd just sort of say as well, like the rural stuff is definitely a really big thing, because you go into the law firms there and they can't really afford to specialise. Like there's no commercial law firm in Horsham. They have to do everything. Like there's not one that does contract law, there's not one that does family law. Like all the firms do as much as they can because they just have to generalise. And if you're willing to relocate and head out there, then you can go into those firms and get so much experience so quickly. Is just by me talking to people that have done that in those places. There was definitely something else, but I wrote it down wrong and now I can't remember what it was. So yeah, I mean, good luck. Resumes, again, really, I hate saying this, but like sell your skills. Like don't just say I sorted files. Like, you know, I closed files. That's something I did. I did it at one firm. I closed files and I had to take out any like identifying documents that were original copies, but that's so boring to write. Say I assisted in establishing parameters, making sure that no original identification document was retained on site. Like, does anyone know, is that one there? No, they don't know what that means, but it sounds better than just saying I closed files. So yeah, good luck.
Hey guys, my name's Luke. Second, virtually everything that's been said, it was very much sort of accorded with the experience I had while I was a student at Adelaide here. I began here in 2015 and I studied crim law in 2016, and Kelly took a few lectures and Kelly was also my tutor, and then I went on and did evidence in my final year. It was probably coincidence that I've ended up doing the criminal law. Currently I work as the legal education solicitor at the Director of Public Prosecutions, and prior to that I was an associate in both the major courts of South Australia, and I'll just sort of talk through how I came to be where I am. Essentially straight after finishing my evidence exam, it was the last exam I had at university, I'd been successful in winning a position as a floating associate at the courts. We've heard a little bit already about being around the courts environment. But what it meant was I was meant to be employed in the Supreme Court, but I got moved to the District Court with the Chief Judge, who himself is technically a Justice of the Supreme Court, and it wound up being one of the best things for me because the District Court does, I would say, in the year I was there, probably 90% of the matters I did were criminal related. Being the court of first instance, you see so much of the bread and butter work that goes into criminal law, the sort of things I wouldn't have noticed had I just been in the Supreme Court, which is the appellate court. So I spent 12 months in the district court, day in, day out. You'd spend some of your time in court, some of your time researching, a lot of your time trying to figure out what was going on, trying to keep up with what the judge was thinking. It was a great experience, as I said, in just learning how a solicitor conducts themselves and has to conduct themselves on a daily basis. It can be very hard and it can be very off the cuff. And there's lots of things that come up that you need to know quickly. So I spent 12 months doing that, and then I went and I was associate to the Chief Justice for the 12 months after that. And it was a good way to do it because, as I said just before, the Supreme Court's the appellate court from the District Court. So I had a year spending doing matters at first instance, so all your factual matters, submissions during guilty pleas, or if it was not guilty plea, through the trial process. Once I got to the Supreme Court, you don't realise how many little issues can crop up in a trial until you come to the appeal court, in which case counsel, who by that stage are more senior counsel, will trawl through 70 pages of a judge's summing up the directions they give to the jury effectively, and they'll pinpoint a line or a sentence or a word that could have caused the jury to reason incorrectly, and that can be the basis of a successful appeal. And it can be the whole way a case falls apart, and it affects the lives of many, many people. So it was a handy thing for me to see it like that, because you get the two clear sides of criminal law, and this is something that I think is quite unique to criminal law, which is so much of it is factual based. A lot of the guys here have said this already. So much of it's about the lives of the people. So much of it's about establishing circumstances, establishing factors, establishing personal circumstances as well outside of the commission of the crime at all. And then the other side is the law, and it can be very interesting. It can be very dull, but it's at least always relevant to certain factual matters, which for me always made the criminal law a lot easier to understand. I never really knew what the hell a trust was, for example, but like I could picture an assault and I could picture these things, and from that you can reason. I found it more easy to reason. So I spent 12 months doing that, and I've been at the Director's office now for 8 weeks. I have kind of an interesting role. I said my title is the Legal Education Solicitor, so I'm the only one of my kind, which means that I don't actually necessarily go into court as much and do submissions, but what I do is I do a lot of research, and I get a lot of random ad hoc questions about things from statutory interpretation to case law, and that's been really interesting, because being in the courts, you see everything at the end result, you see everything at the final stage, after counsel spent sometimes months, sometimes years preparing an argument, and now it's all of a sudden going back right to the start and figuring out, first of all, can we lay a charge? So one of the main things I've been doing early on is what's called charge determination. Police arrest someone, they have to hold someone on a charge. You can't just indefinitely detain someone, although we've heard a little bit about that already earlier. There's some interesting area in that part of the law at the moment. But in general, police have to charge someone. But just because the police charge someone, it doesn't mean that the charge is necessarily made out. And then it will come before our office, and we have to look through the charges and the legislation and determine, do the facts, does the evidence, the affidavit material, any videos that police have recorded, do they meet the crime? Can it be established on the elements? And so that's been a really, really interesting thing. It often at times has felt like I'm a little bit at law school, trying to analyse elements, trying to read case law. But it's been very enjoyable. A couple of general things I'll just say, and I've written these down, just a couple of general pieces of advice. What I've found most helpful in my career so far is to do things well and not hard. They'll often run side by side, but you don't just have to unnecessarily bust your ass, and you don't have to work for overtime every single night. That's not necessarily going to be appreciated. If you give something to a supervisor a little bit later, but you do it really well, they're never going to complain because you did a really good job. It's often people I find, especially when they're young people and especially when they start out, and I had this mentality as well, is you think you just have to bust your ass and be the last one to leave. It's not the case at all, and as everyone here has touched on, it will be detrimental to your mental health, and it really will. So avoid that. Of course, there are instances where you have to work overtime, you'll have to work late. It's just life, but don't do it unnecessarily. The other thing is the criminal law. It's interesting. It can be very juicy, but it's hard and it's very sad. Often when the criminal law, at the point the criminal law operates, is the point the criminal law has already failed, because it means someone's already failed in society, someone's done something wrong, someone's hurt someone, and anytime someone's being sentenced, the victim is often not just a person, it's the person's family, it's the relatives, it's the friends, and it's a whole community that's affected by these things. So just be wary. It's interesting and it's juicy, and it theoretically sounds quite engaging, and it is, but it's always within the other side of the coin is it's often very sad. And the final thing I was going to say was there's not one way to do it. Tabitha sort of mentioned this earlier. I came to uni in 2015. I was 25 or 26 at the time. I'd studied at film school before. Film's still one of the things I care very much about, and I always intended to go to the law, but I didn't care about doing it straight away. I worked as a labourer for a couple of years, and then I came back and started law school. There's no hurry to do anything quickly. Just do things as well as you can when you do them, and that's my advice.
Yeah, I've just got a general question for all of you. A bit cliche, but have any of you come across anything that you feel goes against your own ethics?
Absolutely.
How have you kind of dealt with that kind of crossroad of what you believe is right and what your job's kind of telling you to do?
At the end of the day, just from my experience, we're in criminal defence. We're defending criminals every day. Probably the one I struggle with the most is paedophilia, and because I've got children myself. But I'm there to do a job. It's a bit like when you become a surgeon. You just look at the body as a body. You don't try not to think about the people. I try not to think about the victims. I remember my boss saying to me once, we had a care and protection order that we were defending, and I made the mistake of reading the orders, and she said, don't do that, because then you won't be able to, unless you're actually going in to do submissions. If you're just putting something together, don't read the orders, because when you speak to that client, you're going to want to rip their face off. And she's right, because this particular one was quite abhorrent. So you do have to try and disassociate yourself emotionally from what you're actually reading, seeing, etc. I did Psych 1A a few years ago. I think that actually helped a little bit. And I think if you, particularly with talking to clients, if you haven't done it, think about doing alternate dispute resolution. It does help you, talking to clients and trying to get them to communicate with you as well if you're looking at criminal.
And I think sometimes end of the day, these same law structures will exist well after we're gone, and they existed well before us. So I think it's not to have the expectation that you have to have the definite right or wrong ethical answer to it. You're not a saviour. You're not going to change the criminal statistics single-handedly. It is a job. And in saying that as well, I think the onus, as much as mental health has been raised many, many times, the onus is also on your managers and your employers as well to keep you safe in those situations as well. The expectation isn't on you to necessarily have the answers or know what to do either. Sometimes your clients will be the biggest pain in your asses as well. Like, you'll be working with the people that are the problem. But you also got to understand, and we work in our organisation, we call it a trauma-informed framework or practice, is at the end of the day, this is someone's life and this is their reality. It might not be your reality, it might not be someone else's reality, but that's where it's coming from. You've got to work within that. And then also, after work, have a hobby, have something else to get to. I think it's so important, and stay connected. But I think, after work, you really... my biggest mistake I made was emails on my phone, constantly getting notifications, checking, doing after work hours. I think it's important, once you're done, clock off and go do yoga or go do something fun.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. I think we have a tendency, especially for me, to kind of romanticize things. So for instance, if you want to go work with, a particular law firm, and I know a couple of people who've worked with big law firms, and they've said, this is my dream. And when they've actually worked in it, they've realized this isn't what it's cracked up to be. And that's certainly one thing that I would just caution people to be wary of. For instance, I have this particular place I want to work at. So what I've done is I've looked at their reports, I've looked at a lot of the background to it, I've looked at everything, all the information I can receive, whether that's reviews about the job, whether that's actually talking to people who've worked there. And I found that it's a lot different to how you actually perceive it. So I would definitely recommend actually realizing that it's not going to be 100% hunky-dory. I think sometimes as well in criminal law, you're not there necessarily to do what's popular, but you're there to do what's right. And even if it means representing an unpopular defendant or representing, someone who you just want to rip your face off, as Tab said, you're doing the right thing by giving them a voice. So I'd definitely say, stick to it, do your job, and again, I've only been here for 6 months, so it's not really much I can tell you, but yeah.
I think sorry.
Go on.
I was just going to say, I think you're definitely right about the romanticising things, and I think that comes with your question about ethical hardlines romanticising ethics when it can often be like an ethical soup, we're studying criminal law, you see that concepts of agency and autonomy break down at the point where the criminal law comes into play. So, and I think when you brought up child sex offences, I think fair to say the worst possible thing that you can be confronted with, and that was what drew me to, that's why I was interested in this indefinite detention regime, because it was targeted, the amendments that came in were targeting child sex offenders once they reached the end of their sentence, to impose this order to leave them in, to keep them in jail basically, and so the judges were concerned because obviously this breaches all the underlying punitive jurisprudence that undergirds our criminal law system, but in being so concerned, it gave them the appearance of defending child sex offenders. So of course the media latches onto that. You get all these judge defends pedophile. Justice Hinton would often be on the Advertiser scrolling through, looking at these live headlines as they were coming, and it turns into this sort of back and forth polarisation of judges defend pedophiles, Parliament wants harsher laws, when really if you're going to have any sort of effective criminal law system as well, you have to have principles of consistency. And what I found in the end was that these new laws were such a far departure from what they should be, that judges were just not going near them and not wanting to touch them at all. So that just really made it less safe and less willing to impose these child sex detention orders when they should be imposed. So I think that in terms of romanticising these ethical positions, it's always going to come down to a more complicated than it seems.
Yeah. For me, in terms of difficult contradictions with me, is working with both children and adults who have been in those situations. So I'll have to make a notification about a parent who has done something, and then the following week work with people whose lives have been torn apart and where they're homeless, addicted to drugs, living on the street, mental health is terrible because of losing their children, because they were once in that situation as well. But I'm not allowed to not make those notifications. Like, I have a legal obligation to do that. But then also trying to balance as well when you hear this stuff, because people have spoken about being confronted with the pictures, actually sitting down and having this stuff told to you by a young person who is literally telling you their experience and being completely powerless in that situation to do anything about it, despite in your head wanting to. And when you're with, if you're with a client, if you hear something horrible, you can't get up and go like, oh, I'm going to go fix this for you, because you can't promise that you're going to fix it. If a young person tells me something, I can't go, I'm going to make that better, I'm going to make sure the person that did that goes to prison. I can't promise that. And no one can promise a client that you can fix anything, but what you can do is just try to do something that can change the situation for them and hopefully help them. But it's important to remember that, like, in any situation like this, we don't have the power to just fix it.
And I think too, I always remind myself, if I'm looking at something and I think, this guy really needs to go away, in my head I think everyone deserves a fair trial and everyone has the right to be able to be rehabilitated if that's what they want. And that's what I remind myself of every day.
Yeah, I often find there are at least two sides to every story. And I think a lot of things, when it comes to these moral issues, I think there's not necessarily have to be so binary as if it's right or it's wrong. I think some of these issues kind of exist on a spectrum. So, as you've talked about earlier, there will be multiple shades of grey. For me, if we're working at the Royal Commission, we have to even sometimes look for evidence that disproves what witnesses are saying. So you might have a vulnerable person who said, you know what, I've experienced substandard care, and it's part of our job to verify whether those claims are in fact true and whether they can be admissible before this commission. So there are ethical questions, but again, what you're doing isn't necessarily for one person or for a particular matter. It's for the proper administration of justice. And that involves doing things which are unpopular, which may seem really wrong, but actually it's for the greater good.
It's just great to see people who are so diverse, following what they're interested in and doing so well and sharing with others. It's what it's all about. So I really sincerely thank you for coming today. And I got a lot out of hearing from you, and I think other people did as well. So thank you.